Thanks to Skillshare for supporting this episode of SciShow Psych. The first 1,000 people to click the link in the description can get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare so you can start exploring your creativity today. Being a new parent is hard, and it is different for everyone. You might be doing something you've never done before, and you might need to build up new support systems to work through experiences you have never had. For some people, that includes psychiatric disorders. For example, depression is common in new parents and not just the person who gave birth. And if that's your experience, you are definitely not on that journey alone. There are tools that might help you navigate new parenthood, and they've even been verified by peer-reviewed science. Here's Britt to tell us about research into depression in all parents.
People don't really talk about postpartum depression. After all, you've just had a baby. It's chubby and it smells nice. You should be so happy. But more often than not, new parents aren't. A period of sadness after giving birth is so common that we have a colloquial name for it: the baby blues. 70 to 80% of new parents get it after giving birth, but approximately 1 in 7 experience a sadness that's more severe and lingering: postpartum depression. It's a real disorder that happens to a lot of people, and it's totally treatable. But here's something that might throw you for a loop. It's even pretty common for the parent who didn't give birth. So let's talk about it. First, though, we should mention that this research is mostly focused on straight, cisgender couples having a baby biologically. Obviously, families come in all shapes and sizes, but the science hasn't really caught up yet for same-sex couples, transgender parents, and people who adopt. So there's not much we can say about postpartum depression in those groups. Chop chop, science! But with that important caveat, postpartum depression as we understand it today is a mood disorder that occurs after childbirth. It causes sadness, exhaustion, and anxiety that interferes with day-to-day life. For women having a child, it usually starts shortly after birth and can last weeks or months. It can affect any new mother. It doesn't matter if the pregnancy was hard or easy. And for half of the women diagnosed with it, it's their first ever depressive episode. Postpartum depression, also known as PPD, can look really different in different people, which can make it tricky to diagnose and understand. Symptoms for women often include mood swings, frequent crying, trouble bonding with the baby, tiredness, fear that they won't be a good mother, and a sense of worthlessness or shame. The symptoms also tend to include a lot more restlessness and impaired decision-making than other kinds of depression. Much less attention has been given to PPD in men, which means it's much harder to tell how many new fathers experience it. Estimates range from 4 to 25%. If nothing else, we do know that, for them, PPD sets in a little longer after the baby is born. Still, because men tend to present as more anxious than women do when they're depressed, some experts think we might not have the right tools to evaluate whether men have PPD. There's also still a lot of debate about what causes this kind of depression. There are a couple hypotheses, and one is that it has to do with hormones, which makes perfect sense to anyone who has ever had PMS. In women, estrogen, progesterone, prolactin, and cortisol all drop dramatically after childbirth. And men experience fluctuating levels of similar hormones, along with testosterone and vasopressin, during and immediately after their female partner's pregnancy. But studies of both humans and non-human animals haven't been able to draw a solid link between specific hormones and the symptoms of PPD. Another idea is that this condition has to do with all the intense life change that's happening when you have a baby. Transitioning to parenthood is hard. There's the sleep deprivation, the need to develop a new sense of identity, the sleep deprivation, the change in your day-to-day routine, the gap between the support you thought you were going to get from your friends and family and what you're actually getting. Oh, and did I mention the sleep deprivation? Ultimately, most psychologists agree that PPD is caused by a mix of biological and social factors, a wild hormonal cocktail dumped on top of one of the most stressful periods someone can experience. And with that in mind, there are some risk factors that can predict how likely you are to get postpartum depression. They include a previous history of depression, a poor marital relationship, or a lack of social support, and stressful life events. In men, the strongest predictor is whether their female partner has PPD, with 25 to 50% of new fathers experiencing this kind of depression if their female partner also has it. But here's the thing. Even if we don't know exactly what causes PPD, we do know that it's pretty bad news for the kid. There's a ton of research showing that parental depression can affect children's development. The list just goes on, from delayed cognitive development and motor function, to difficult temperament, to attentional difficulties. And having 2 depressed parents is even more of a risk factor for these problems than 1. The good news is that PPD can be treated with therapy. Several studies have found that women who received interpersonal therapy recovered from their depressive episodes significantly better than those in a waiting list condition. And cognitive behavioral therapy, which works with patients to challenge problematic thoughts and change destructive patterns of behavior, has also been shown to work. Medications can help too, but breastfeeding women do need to be careful about which ones they take. Really, a bigger problem is that people don't seek out help. Over the years, studies have found that many women believed their PPD was a normal reaction to new motherhood or were ashamed of it. Some were even afraid that being labeled as mentally ill would make others think they couldn't be trusted to be good moms, which is not okay. We have got to destigmatize this stuff so that people can get the help they need without fear or shame. To that end, many experts have advocated for making PPD screening and treatment a normal part of prenatal care. But in the meantime, we've just got to keep talking about it.
Depression can be debilitating. It can be incredibly intrusive, especially during this sensitive time of having just become a parent. But depression is not the only postpartum psychiatric disorder. Here's Britt to explain other ways becoming a new parent can affect the brain.
Having a newborn can be a joyous experience, but it can also be overwhelming. After all, you're suddenly responsible for this helpless, needy human being. And while they might be super adorable, they're also not that interesting for a while. On top of that, there are all kinds of hormone fluctuations, sleep disruptions, and potential complications from labor and delivery. So even if you're not the one who gave birth, there's a lot to deal with. These days, it's becoming more well known that things like postpartum depression exist. But the reality is, depression isn't the only postpartum disorder out there. Having a kid does some weird things to the brain, and that can lead to or aggravate all kinds of psychiatric conditions. According to the World Health Organization, up to 20% of people who give birth develop postpartum psychiatric disorders. These include depression, anxiety, OCD, PTSD, and psychosis. And without screening and treatment, they can take a serious toll on someone and their child. They can also happen to a parent who doesn't give birth. The research is more limited there, especially when it comes to groups like adoptive parents, but data suggests that at least 5 to 10% of new dads develop postpartum depression, and up to 18% develop postpartum anxiety disorders. No matter whom you're studying, though, figuring out what causes these conditions is extremely tricky because there are so many variables involved. Anything from genetics to finances could play a role, and in general, postpartum conditions are still underdiagnosed and understudied. But even though the science isn't crystal clear, that doesn't mean researchers have no idea what's happening. Take one study of more than 8,000 women in England. It identified that two of the greatest risk factors for developing any postpartum psychiatric disorder were anxiety and depression during pregnancy. Other studies have found that having a history of any mental illness before having kids seems to increase the overall risk too. But that isn't where their research has stopped. For each of the major conditions, scientists have also managed to identify factors that might play a large role. For one, they think social and environmental factors play a huge part in postpartum depression and anxiety disorders. These factors include marital status, finances, family support, food security, and more. And while research is ongoing, the general idea is that these things may cause symptoms by influencing someone's hormone levels or gene expression. A good example of when this happens is with postpartum depression. Its symptoms include overwhelming feelings of sadness, severe fatigue, and loss of interest in daily activities. And in the US, it's thought to affect up to 1 in 5 parents who give birth. But the data also suggests that those numbers can go up when people experience things like food insecurity or a lack of access to healthcare. Factors like this can also impact whether someone develops postpartum generalized anxiety disorder, which involves chronic worry. And they can influence postpartum obsessive-compulsive disorder, which involves unwanted thoughts and repetitive behaviors. Some conditions even have more specific environmental causes, like postpartum PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. Someone with this condition will feel severe distress when they think about a certain trauma, and they'll avoid things that remind them of it. And in this case, the cause can actually be pretty straightforward. It's not true for all people, but postpartum PTSD can happen when birth felt traumatic. Of course, just because scientists think these factors play a big role doesn't mean they're the only culprits. Someone's genetic background will also contribute to their mental health. For some disorders, though, researchers believe that things like genetics and hormones play an even bigger part. A good example is with postpartum psychosis. This is among the rarest and most severe postpartum psychiatric illnesses, and it typically requires immediate intervention. Although it's hard to get a clear estimate, it seems to occur in roughly 1 or 2 people out of every 1,000 who give birth, and the symptoms appear within a few days or weeks following delivery. Those symptoms start suddenly too, and they include paranoia, grandiose, bizarre delusions, and extreme mood swings. And unlike conditions like OCD or anxiety, these impairments can be so severe that someone becomes in danger of harming their child. Thankfully, there are treatments for this disorder, but because it can appear so fast and is so extreme, scientists have spent time looking at the risk factors. So far, the biggest one seems to be bipolar disorders. In fact, evidence suggests that postpartum psychosis is actually just an extreme version of these conditions, and that it happens when hormone changes after birth crank existing symptoms way up. The case isn't totally closed on this, though, since some research has found that at least half of those who ended up with postpartum psychosis hadn't been diagnosed with bipolar disorders. And there are also some data that suggest that some cases of postpartum psychosis could be an extreme form of postpartum depression, or the onset or recurrence of disorders like schizophrenia. Regardless, it's not a bad idea for those with a history of these conditions to talk with their doctor before giving birth. Ultimately, though, understanding the risk factors for all of these conditions is important, because they allow patients to make informed decisions during or after having a child. Even just acknowledging them is great, because lack of awareness, stigmas, or the belief that having a baby is supposed to be super amazing can all leave parents suffering. But hey, having a new kid is a whirlwind, and there's no shame if that takes a toll on your mental health. Just learning that these disorders can happen is a good place to start. And the nice thing is, there are plenty of screening methods and treatments available for them. So even if scientists are still trying to pin down exactly why they happen, they've at least found ways to help.
Thanks, Britt, for that reminder to new parents to prioritize their mental health. Postpartum disorders are common, and there is no shame in seeking help. This episode of SciShow Psych was supported by Skillshare. They have a class called Drawing as Self-Discovery, 5 Ways to Start. Illustrator Mari Andrew leads the class in a really caring way. All of the classes are around 5 minutes long, so that you have time to focus on those exercises and others like healing through art. Especially when you have a kid, time is precious, so Skillshare's online learning community offers a premium membership that gives you unlimited access whenever you have the time and need it most. You can join the classes and communities that are just right for you with support from fellow creatives to accomplish real growth, and the first 1,000 people to click the link in the description will get a 1-month free trial of premium membership. Thank you to Skillshare for supporting this SciShow Psych video. So far in this video, we've been focusing on new parents, but parenting is hard work no matter how old your kids are. During the spring of 2020, that became even more obvious when schools closed and families were all at home together due to the pandemic. As a society, we started talking more about burnout in parents, and luckily, there's research about it. Here's Anthony to explain what parental burnout looks like and how you can hopefully avoid it.
Parents are often typecast as people who never tire out. From feeding kids all hours of the night to being at every Little League game or band concert, they're often cast as superhuman. But as obvious as it sounds, parents aren't magical, limitless beings, and they can get burnt out just like anyone else. Well, maybe not just like anyone else. Research is starting to show that their brand of burnout seems to be unique. And by learning to identify it fast, we can help avoid it. Psychologists define burnout as a state of emotional, physical, and mental exhaustion caused by excessive and prolonged stress. We often associate it with school or work, and until somewhat recently, this was the main way psychologists thought about it too. But lately, they found that parenthood leads to similar effects. A study published in 2014 used testimonies from 901 parents, and it identified 4 main factors to parental burnout. First, people felt exhausted while parenting, though not necessarily while doing other things like being at work. They also felt like they were losing pleasure and fulfillment in their parental role. And finally, burned out parents emotionally distanced themselves from their children and were prone to contrasting parenthood with their lives before kids. Those first 2 traits are pretty similar to career burnout, but this study showed that the last 2 are unique. Workers don't tend to dwell on their pre-job lives, and they're also prone to dehumanizing the people they work with. In a way, burned out parents don't seem to dehumanize their kids, which is reassuring actually. Using these 4 traits as a starting point, you can measure parental burnout with surveys that ask parents to rate how true statements feel. Things like, I sometimes feel as though I'm taking care of my children on autopilot. And these surveys place the frequency of parental burnout at anywhere between 2 and 12%. That's a whole lot of tired parents. But this research was done on parents in Europe, so the numbers could vary by culture. We'll learn more as studies continue. Still, Considering parental burnout can impact the level of care parents provide to their kids and themselves, it's important we learn how to identify and reduce it. So how do you figure out when someone is at risk? There seem to be a few ways. For example, researchers have looked at the well-tested Big Five personality traits, and they suggest that high levels of neuroticism and low levels of agreeableness or conscientiousness might make parents prone to burnout. These are traits associated with having a hard time maintaining positive emotional relationships, responding to other people's needs, and keeping a well-structured home environment. Things that could make existing parental stress worse. But on the flip side, aiming for perfection can cause burnout too, as one 2018 study on Japanese parents pointed out. As any motivational speaker will tell you, no one's perfect. And chasing that impossible goal can set someone up to expend a lot of physical and mental effort. That exertion, along with the eventual realization that there's no way to be the perfect parent, can be demoralizing and send someone into burnout. Finally, and more generally, some researchers believe the balance between parenting risks and resources is a big player in burnout too. When the resources at hand, including money, support, or time, aren't enough to meet the demands of parenting, that leads to more stress. And if that stress is sustained, burnout becomes more and more likely. Thankfully, spotting this stress early can help avert disaster. If you notice a parent constantly striving to meet unrealistic goals, it might be time to check if they're doing all right. Helping them avoid burnout could be a case of providing more resources to tip the balance, like offering to take their kids to Little League practice every other week. For parents, taking time to decompress can also be a great option. Hiring a babysitter or sending the kids to a relative's place for the night might provide enough room to rest and recalibrate. But those options can be costly or impractical and might not be an option for everyone. So an upcoming 2020 paper suggests a more accessible option. Talk it out. Talking about struggling as a parent can feel shameful. There's a lot of pressure to be the world's #1 parent, like it says on all those coffee mugs. But engaging with people or groups that acknowledge that parenting is hard can lighten the load. Research in other areas of psychology has shown the power of expressing yourself in a non-judgmental atmosphere, and psychologists believe it could be just as effective with parental burnout. So yes, science is endorsing getting it all out on parental Facebook groups. Share all the memes. Just be sure you're not yelling into the void. Talking to other people rather than just talking is key. At the end of the day, burnout is probably not what people hoped for when they became parents, but progress is being made about how to identify and avoid it. I mean, babysitters and rides to baseball practice aren't magical cures, but the more we recognize burnout for what it is, a real thing, the better off we'll be.
That's a great action item that Anthony shared. Talk it out. It can be hard at first, but talking about what you're feeling can help. Of course, managing our own feelings is hard enough, but part of what makes parenthood so challenging is helping your kids work through their emotions and how to express them. If you've spent a significant amount of time with a toddler, I think you know where I'm headed with this, the science of temper tantrums. These intense expressions of emotion are normal and more complex than we previously thought. Here's Anthony, along with a very special guest, to tell us more about how scientists are studying temper tantrums.
If you've spent time with a toddler, you've probably experienced the sound and the fury of a temper tantrum. You know, the kind where a tiny child morphs into a wailing volcano of seemingly unbridled rage. But recent research shows there's much more going on, and we can learn a lot from temper tantrums, especially when it comes to what toddlers actually think and feel. And that means we can use tantrums as a tool to help support kids' healthy development. When a toddler throws a tantrum, it's basically their brain's threat detection system working overtime. So there's a lot going on in their amygdala, which is the part of the brain responsible for processing big feelings, and in their hypothalamus, the brain center that controls unconscious things like heart rate and body temperature. And that would actually be all fine and dandy if it weren't for the fact that their prefrontal cortex, the part that helps regulate emotions and behaviors, isn't fully developed. So when a toddler totally loses it because their socks are the wrong color, it's because they literally can't control their overwhelming feelings yet. Now, historically, researchers thought that those overwhelming feelings were just one emotion: anger. They literally defined tantrums as violent outbursts of rage. In fact, a diagnostic text from 1937 went as far as to describe tantrums as the strong desire to disturb, destroy, annoy, or annihilate. And this idea that toddlers were just unpredictable rage monsters informed a lot of parenting strategies over the years, even though it's wrong. Like, experts actually suggested splashing kids with cold water to cool their fury, which, for the record, is a terrible idea. By the 1990s, psychologists realized that there are actually two distinct emotions involved in temper tantrums: anger and sadness, which matters because the ways of helping a child through those emotions can differ. For instance, an angry toddler may not want to be comforted, while a sad toddler may not respond well to being left alone. But even then, the prevailing idea was that one emotion flowed from the other, like kids would start angry and end up sad, or vice versa. So, the best response to a tantrum would depend on what stage of it the kid was in, though no one could agree on which emotion was first. More recently, psychologists have come to realize that tantrums are much more complex because toddlers actually experience a range of emotions and emotional intensities, and they're feeling all those feels at the same time. From an article published in Emotion in 2011, scientists used onesies outfitted with microphones to study whether toddlers' vocalizations, like screams and whines, could shed more light on the emotional component of tantrums. In all, they analyzed almost 1,300 vocalizations from 24 tantrums and found that toddlers expressed different levels of anger and sadness at different audio frequencies. They used lower frequency, quieter vocalizations when they were feeling sad. And when they became angry, their vocalizations increased in both energy and frequency. They also saw that the pattern of the frequencies over time was different for different emotions. Sad sounds peaked in the middle, while angry ones spiked at the beginning. These unique patterns allow the researchers to track the timing of emotions throughout tantrums. And rather than feeling one or the other, the little ones express both sadness and anger basically the whole time. So not only do a toddler's screams communicate how angry or sad they are, those emotions are more intertwined and simultaneous than we used to think. All of this means that comforting a child during a tantrum is kind of hard, but listening can help caregivers make sure they're responding to a child's emotions in the most effective way. Another tried and true tactic is to stay as calm as possible, because that actually helps calm them down. Researchers aren't completely sure why, but some think it has to do with mirror neurons. Mirror neurons are neurons that light up when we mirror or mimic an action that's being performed by another person. So, they get activated while you're trying to follow your yoga teacher's movements, for instance. And while even neuroscientists still don't know a ton about how they work, psychological researchers think that they could also play a role in emotional mimicry. Essentially, when a toddler sees someone being calm, their mirror neurons might kick in and tell them to mimic that calmness. Whereas if you get heated, you could be subconsciously telling their brains to dial things up. Plus, keeping a cool head is key to being there for a toddler who needs help navigating the roller coaster of anger and sadness they're feeling. That's because staying calm helps you make better choices. When a toddler's behavior makes us angry, we're more likely to make rash decisions that don't fix the situation. In fact, these can make things worse. Meanwhile, by keeping calm and observing toddlers' tantrum behavior, we can pick up on signs that a kiddo might need extra help with handling their emotions. For example, while tantrums are a perfectly normal part of a toddler's development, toddlers that have lots of long, destructive tantrums may have an underlying mood or disruptive behavior disorder. And diagnosing and treating these early in life can help kids have better outcomes. So when we understand toddlers' temper tantrums, we can use them to help support kids' healthy development. And while knowing the why behind a toddler tantrum might not make it any easier to get through, remember, they're just trying to figure out this human emotion stuff. And that's hard, even for adults, right?
Yeah, a temper tantrum can be rough, but they help us understand the complex feelings that our kids are experiencing. And kids actually start developing the ability to understand other people's complex feelings a lot sooner than you might think. Here's an older episode from me about when and how kids develop empathy. You know when you're reading a really good book and something intense happens to one of your favorite characters, so you are also hit with like a wave of feelings? You might feel a little silly as you reach for a box of tissues, but it's a normal human thing to understand and relate to other people's feelings, even fictional people. We call this empathy. Empathy might seem pretty straightforward, but we know from research that it involves a complex network of brain areas that process things like emotion, thought, and understanding social cues. Many of these brain regions aren't fully developed until late adolescence or early adulthood, so it takes a while for little kids to get it right. To understand the different pieces of the empathy puzzle, scientists often divide it into three components: emotional, motivational, and cognitive. And to figure out how and when empathy develops naturally, researchers study how kids behave in different situations. The emotional part refers to sharing someone else's feelings. For example, researchers have tested this by monitoring brain activity as adults watch someone else's hand getting poked with a needle. And you're like your brain does things. And the brains of people watching typically show a similar response pattern to the person actually being poked. This suggests that we actually feel something similar when we see someone in pain. And it seems like this kind of empathy may develop pretty quickly. We think babies as young as 6 to 8 months show early signs of it, when they make sounds or facial expressions that mirror others who are upset. Next up is the motivational component, which is basically the urge to do something for someone else's well-being, like wanting to comfort a friend when they've lost a pet or family member. And even though children might mirror each other's emotions early on, it takes a few years for this motivational part to kick in. When they're about 3 to 6 years old, kids might show behaviors like sharing their favorite stuffed animal to make someone else feel better when they seem sad. Now, the third and maybe most complicated part of empathy is the cognitive component. In the research world, this is sometimes called theory of mind. It's the ability to take another person's perspective, think about their experience, and understand why it would make them feel the way they do. This requires some mental gymnastics, so it's not a huge surprise that it seems to be the hardest part of empathy for young children to do well, and it's easy to mistake for selfishness or meanness. One of the most well-known ways to study theory of mind is called a false belief task. Like there's the Sally Ann task, which involves a short scenario that gets played out with dolls. It goes like this: Sally has a basket, and her friend Ann has a box. Sally puts a marble in her basket and then leaves to go for a walk. While Sally is gone, Ann takes the marble from the basket and puts it into her own box. Jerk move, Anne. After all this, researchers ask children where Sally will look for the marble when she gets back. Kids under 3 years of age will usually say that Sally will look in Anne's box because they saw the marble move, which sounds a little weird to our adult brains. From other questions, researchers can tell that kids are following the logic of the story and understand that Sally didn't see the marble move. But it seems like they have trouble understanding or expressing the fact that Sally's perspective is different from their own. Some researchers think that even if young kids might get that people have different feelings or perspectives, they can't describe it with their cognitive and language abilities. Because the brain systems involved in these abilities become more efficient as connections between neurons develop and change, by age 4 to 5, answers start to change. Basically, their brains are more able to process complex information, so more kids say that Sally would look in her own basket for the marble because that's where she left it. Now, the jury's still out on exactly how and when full-blown empathy develops, but your first few years of life involve a lot of learning about feelings and thoughts. Talking with kids about their emotions, suggesting ways they could show empathy, or even reading stories about feelings can help them figure this stuff out. And then, when they get a little older, you can just give them a good book, and also maybe a box of tissues. It can be very rewarding to see your little one cultivate care and understanding for others. In the end, there are a lot of reasons that what you're doing right now is really hard for you and your kid, but that does not mean that you're doing anything wrong. So cut yourself some slack, and remember, you're doing your best. If you're looking to learn more about talking through what you're feeling, you can watch our video on teletherapy. Thank you all so much for watching.